87% of your lifetime investment growth can hide in the last stretch of the journey. And that single fact should disturb you, because if the payoff hides at the end, then the real danger is not choosing the wrong stock. The real danger is quitting during the years when the machine still looks dead. I have spent my life around capital, and one lesson has only become clearer with time. Most people do not fail at compounding because they are incapable of understanding math. They fail because the early years insult their emotions. They expect progress to feel rewarding before progress becomes powerful. They want visible proof before the structure has earned the right to provide it. They want the applause of results while they are still supposed to be building the habit that makes results possible. That is why I want to give you a harder frame. Compounding is not a miracle. It is a night shift. At the beginning, you are the only worker in the building. You show up. You earn, you save, you push, you carry the whole weight yourself. Then one day, if you have not sabotaged the system, money starts showing up after hours. Quietly, no noise, no drama, no compliments, just a second worker taking over part of the load while you sleep. Later still, that night shift can become stronger than your daytime labor ever was. Most people never reach that handoff, not because the handoff is fake, because the first years are so boring that they leave the building before the second worker arrives. That is the trap. The world teaches people to respect visible effort. A job looks real. A paycheck looks real. A side hustle looks real. Overtime looks real. But the early phase of compounding looks almost insulting. You put money away and nothing cinematic happens. The line crawls. The gains are tiny. The market wiggles a few dollars up and down, as if it is mocking your seriousness. You begin to suspect that the whole thing is a story rich people tell, to make patience sound noble. It is not a story, but it is a test. And the test is not about intelligence. It is about survival. The source you gave me understands that part better than most personal finance content does. The real problem is not that people never hear the word compounding. The problem is that they hear the word and imagine the end state immediately. They imagine charts curving upward. They imagine accounts growing on their own. They imagine a day when returns are bigger than contributions. What they do not imagine is the emotional dead zone at the beginning, where everything feels too small to matter and too slow to defend. File site turn 31 file 0 that dead zone ruins people. I want to show you why by turning the source S main example into the deeper lesson it is really trying to teach. The source gives us a man named Harry. He is ordinary on purpose that matters. He works in a loud customer support environment. He earns around $43,400 a year before tax, after deductions. The monthly deposit hitting his bank account is roughly $2,619. Rent eats more than $1,100, food and transportation chew up hundreds more. By the time the dust settles, the margin in his checking account is laughably thin, $50, $60, the kind of number that makes future thinking feel almost rude. File site turn 31 file 0 this is where weak advice usually begins lying. Weak advice tells Harry to think bigger. I would tell Harry to think more structurally, because the first question is not how to get rich quickly. The first question is how to stay in the building long enough for the night shift to arrive. That is a much more serious question. The source gets this right when it says Harry does not get rescued by a huge promotion or some cinematic inheritance. What changes first is not his income. What changes first is how he interprets the boring stage. He reads ideas about long-term investing, about starting early, about staying in the game, about the disproportionate power of the late years. And instead of chasing a giant move, he does something almost embarrassingly small. He opens a simple account and automates a tiny purchase of $37 a month. 37, not 300, not 1,030. 7 Fayfula site turn 31 file 0 Fay. Now that number matters for one reason only. It is small enough to survive. That is the first stage of compounding, not the growth stage, the survival stage. This is where almost all bad financial advice fails ordinary people. It keeps telling them what is mathematically optimal in a spreadsheet, while ignoring what is psychologically survivable in a real life. A struggling person does not need the perfect contribution number. He needs the largest number that does not trigger self-sabotage. He needs the number that can keep leaving the room every month without making him flinch. He needs a number that is boring enough to continue. That is why I respect tiny systems more than heroic promises. Heroic promises flatter the ego. Tiny systems survive the weak. The source then walks through what actually happens in those early months. And this is the part most people are never shown honestly enough. Harry checks the account almost every day at first. That is predictable. He sees just over $100 after a few months. The balance is up one day, down the next. The entire experiment feels flimsy. From an emotional standpoint, he could easily conclude that it is pointless. $37 a month does not make him feel rich. It barely makes him feel adult. Fay turn 31 file 0 Fay, that is boredom. And boredom is one of the most underrated destroyers in money. People think risk is the main enemy. They think crashes are the main enemy. Sometimes those are enemies. Yes, but for ordinary investors in the early years, boredom is often much more lethal than volatility. Volatility at least looks dramatic. Boredom looks harmless. It quietly whispers that this is not worth the effort, that you can always start later when you have real money. That $37 is silly, that the account is too small to deserve your respect. If you listen to that whisper, you are finished. Because the early stage of compounding is not trying to impress you. It is trying to train you. It is training you to separate action from emotion. It is training you to stop asking whether the account feels exciting enough. It is training you to behave like an allocator before you have allocator-sized money. That is why I say the first stage is survival, not growth. What has to survive is not just the account. What has to survive is the habit. The source becomes even more valuable when life punches Harry in the face in year one. His car needs repair, almost $500. Old Harry would have raided the little investment account called the experiment cute while it lasted and reset himself to zero. New Harry does something much more important. He protects the system, he picks up extra shifts, he sells something he no longer uses, he solves the problem without touching the capital. That moment is not about the money, the account is still small, it is about identity. He stops seeing the investments as spending money with a different name and starts seeing them as protected seeds. Fay turn 31 file 0 Fay, this is the second stage identity. The source names it correctly in spirit, even if most people will not appreciate its weight. Compounding does not become powerful because your returns are large at first. It becomes powerful because your identity changes before the numbers do. You stop treating invested money as general purpose cash. You stop seeing every problem as permission to cannibalize the future. You begin to act like a person who understands that the system matters more than the immediate emotional relief of tearing it apart. This stage is brutal because the reward still looks small. By the end of year one, Harry has contributed about $444, and maybe the account shows roughly $469, a whole year of discipline, and the visible gain barely covers a grocery run. Any shallow observer would laugh, but shallow observers never get rich. They are too busy measuring the early years by the wrong scoreboard. Fay turn 31 file 0 Fay, the wrong scoreboard asks, how much profit did this produce right away? The right scoreboard asks, did the system survive another year? That is a much more important question. If the system survives, the future remains open. If the system dies, all later magic dies with it. This is what the crowd keeps misunderstanding. They think the early years are supposed to validate the strategy financially. In truth, the early years mostly validate it behaviorally. They prove whether you are capable of planting in silence. They prove whether you can keep paying your future self before your present self starts negotiating. They prove whether you understand that visible reward is not the same thing as structural progress. Then the source shows something else that matters immensely. Harry does not leap from 37 to some heroic contribution. He nudges a little raise, a little overtime, $5 more, $7 more. By the end of year two, the monthly investment is in the 50s, and total deposits are around $1,100, with the account showing something above $1,200. The gap is still small, but it no longer feels like pocket change. It feels like the investments are beginning to help. Fay turn 31. File 0 Fay. This is the third stage, separation. I want you to understand that word. Separation means your money begins to feel like a different worker in the household. It is still a weak worker. It is still part-time. It is still nowhere near carrying the family. But it is no longer imaginary. The account is now doing something without asking you for more hours of labor in direct exchange. That changes the emotional geometry of the whole game until separation happens. Investing feels like deprivation after separation begins. Investing starts feeling like recruitment. You are hiring capital. That is a wonderful shift. Most people never feel it because they either invest too little and quit, or they try to invest too heroically and burn out, or they keep pulling money out whenever life gets inconvenient. The source small, Boring nudges matter because they show the real path. You do not need to impress the machine. You need to keep feeding it in a way the rest of your life can tolerate. That is what people hate about good advice. It is rarely glamorous enough to feel smart. This is where the source brings in older wisdom about paying yourself first. And that matters because it connects the modern index fund routine to a timeless principle. The principle is not really about one product or one platform. The principle is moral order. Your future gets paid first, not if there is leftovers, not if the month felt gentle, not if your mood cooperates first. That one inversion is so powerful because it changes the legal status of the money in your own mind. It is no longer available for casual consumption. It belongs to a different version of you. Fay Falicite Fay Turn 31 File 0 Fay. That is the legal fiction wealthy people live by. Future money is not spare money, it is protected money. Once you internalize that, the system becomes much harder to kill. Then the source fast forwards to year 5, and this is where ordinary people begin making terrible interpretive errors. Harry is now contributing just over $100 a month, and after 5 years the account is around $6,000 something, with roughly $1,000 of that being growth. Shallow people still shrug. 5 years for a 4-figure gain. They call it slow. They say it proves the whole strategy is overrated. They have no idea what they are looking at. Fay Falicite Fay Turn 31 File 0 Fay, what they are looking at is the night shift clocking in weekly. Yes, but real $1,000 of growth that required no direct extra labor is not the final victory. It is the proof of concept. It means the machine is no longer purely symbolic. The worker you hired in silence is now carrying part of the load, still small enough to mock, still early enough to underestimate, but no longer theoretical. This is where poor minds make one of their worst mistakes. They mistake not life-changing yet for not important. That error destroys more long-term wealth than a bad market year. Because if you keep making it, you never get to the later stages where the curve bends. The source explains that bend very well around year 8 or 9. The account may finally show a gap large enough to feel substantial. Deposits around $11,000 and change, balance around $15,000 or $16,000. Suddenly the gain is not just a nice lunch or a grocery run. It is a used car. It is meaningful rent. It is visible mass. The owner wakes up one morning and realizes the portfolio grew more in a good stretch than he himself contributed. That is the invisible line. The machine did not become magical that month. The base simply became large enough for the compounding to become emotionally undeniable. Fay Falicite Fay Turn 31 File 0 Fay. This is the 4th stage. The handoff. I love that stage because it changes what the job even is. Before the handoff, your job is to push the system. After the handoff, your job becomes protecting the system from your own stupidity. That is a very different assignment. At the beginning, the question is how to keep contributing despite boredom. After the handoff, the question becomes how to keep your lifestyle from cannibalizing the machine. How to resist the urge to feel rich early, how to remain invested when the world around you is performing well theatrically, how to avoid pulling the money out just because you finally can. This is why so many people still fail after doing a lot, right? They survive the boredom stage, they survive the identity stage, they survive long enough to glimpse the handoff, then they get sloppy. They tell themselves they deserve more upgrades now. They let housing expand too early, they let the car absorb the raise, they let the social pressure of looking prosperous outrun the internal logic of compounding. The source hints at this when it says Harry keeps his lifestyle a step behind his income. That single phrase is more valuable than many entire books, because that is what keeps the night shift growing. If lifestyle rises as fast as every raise, then labor remains the main worker forever. If lifestyle stays slightly behind, then every increase in income can feed the second worker over time. The second worker stops being second at all. Fay Falicite Fay Turn 31 File 0 Fay. This is how compounding becomes almost unfair. Not because the world suddenly gives you gifts, because the base becomes large enough that time begins throwing more weight than effort once did. In a strong market year in the later stage, Harry's account may grow by $3,000 or $4,000 without any dramatic extra contributions. That detail matters because it reveals the real asymmetry of the whole process. The early $37 deposits were not powerful because of their size. They were powerful because of their duration. They got more years on the clock. They hired more years of night labor. Late dollars are useful too, but early dollars get more shifts. Fay Falicite Fay Turn 31 File 0 Fay. That is one of the most important ideas in the entire source, and I want to sharpen it into a weapon for you. Early dollars are small workers who stay the longest. Late dollars may be larger workers, but they arrive for fewer shifts. That is why starting matters so much. Not because the first deposits look impressive, because their time card is longer. Every year you delay is not just a year without contributions. It is a year of night work that never gets hired, a missing shift, a missing multiplication event, a missing layer of future support. People tell themselves they will make it up later with larger amounts. Sometimes they can partially compensate, but a long run of missed night shifts is brutally hard to replace. This is why I get irritated when people say they will start when they can do it properly. Properly for most people means survivably, not heroically, not optimally, survivably. If $10 is what the system can handle, then $10 is a serious start. The source says this very clearly by implication. What matters most is not whether the first number flatters you. What matters is that the first number creates a protected routine you can later widen. Faithful site, Fayturn 31 file 0 Fay. That is why I would rather see a person automate $29 honestly than fantasize about $500 emotionally, and then fail by month 3. People laugh at small beginnings because they are addicted to visible scale. They do not understand that scale in compounding is delayed. The early years are not for showing off, they are for staying alive. That is the real lesson of Harry S. story. Not that you can become rich from one tiny deposit. Not that life is easy. Not that every month will feel empowering. The real lesson is that the early stage is less about results than about non-cancellation. That line from the source is worth more than it looks. If the great years are at the end, then the early years are not supposed to make you feel powerful. They are supposed to keep you in the game long enough to access the years that do. That is why the emotional model must change. In the first decade, you are not trying to impress yourself with returns. You are trying to outlast your own boredom, your own insecurity, your own desire for visible proof, and the social world's endless encouragement to consume your future for the sake of present identity. Faithful site, Fayturn 31, file 0 Fay. That is the true compounding battle. Not stock picking, not prediction. Endurance. Endurance is what lets the second worker grow from invisible to helpful, from helpful to meaningful, from meaningful to dominant. And make no mistake, dominance is what you are eventually after. Not in the crude sense of luxury, in the strategic sense of labor, no longer being your only worker. That is wealth at its deepest, reduced coercion. Reduced dependence, more room, more patience, more ability to refuse stupidity. When your account begins adding more than you can comfortably save from labor, your posture changes. You do not become a king, but you stop being purely a servant of the next paycheck. The future begins arriving under its own power. That is what most people secretly want. They say they want money. Often what they really want is a second worker strong enough to reduce fear. That second worker is built in the years that look least rewarding. Now I want to say something brutal that the source implies but does not drive hard enough. The reason so many people fail in the first decade is not just that the numbers are small, it is that the culture around them is built to make small compounding feel ridiculous. Everyone around you is spending visibly. People upgrade apartments, clothes, phones, vacations, image. They look richer than you in the short term because they are drawing their emotional reward from spending while you are drawing your strategic reward from planting. Spending is photogenic. Compounding is invisible. That is why weak minds keep defecting. They would rather look like they are winning than actually build a machine that wins later. I have no use for that trade. And if you want real wealth, neither should you. One of the best lines hiding inside the source is that wealth is what you do not see. That is true, and it matters enormously in the first 10 years. The account balance is not yet large enough to broadcast power. The life may still look ordinary, the car may still be plain, the apartment may still be 1 year behind what your peers choose, the wardrobe may still be modest, the social proof may be weak. Good that invisibility is one reason the second worker survives. Loud lifestyles kill compounding because they demand public evidence before the machine is ready to provide it. Quiet investing amplifies because it does not need witnesses. That is why I like silence so much in money. Silence lets the night shift work. Let me also tell you what not to do during the handoff period, because this is where a lot of people commit delayed self-harm. Do not suddenly start treating the account like a scoreboard for your ego. Do not let a few strong years trick you into thinking risk no longer matters. Do not turn the whole portfolio into a casino because the balance finally looks substantial. Do not let a single strong market stretch your self-image beyond your actual discipline. And above all, do not confuse access with permission. Just because the machine is stronger does not mean it should now be milked to support vanity. The handoff is not an invitation to relax. It is proof that the system deserves even more protection. That is where mature investors differ from emotional ones. Emotional investors want the account to justify spending. Mature investors want the account to justify further patience. The first group freezes compounding at the exact moment it becomes exciting. The second group lets the night shift grow into something enormous. This is why a lot of lifetime investment growth hides late, not because the universe favors old age sentimentally, because compounding is backloaded by nature. The later years sit on a much bigger base. The night worker has had years to gain strength. The returns are falling on a large pile instead of a small one. The same percentage now throws off a completely different dollar amount that looks unfair only to people who ignored what had to happen beforehand. Nothing unfair happened, pressure accumulated, time did its work, and somebody had the discipline to keep the machine alive while it looked unimpressive. That is all. But that all is enough to separate the lives of people who end up strong from those who remain permanently manual. So what should you actually take from this if you are early in the process and worried your own account looks too small to matter? First, stop asking your early investments to provide emotional excitement. They are not for that. They are for identity construction and system protection. Second, size the habit for survival, not bravado. The right first contribution is the amount you can continue, not the amount that sounds heroic when you say it out loud. Third, treat invested money as untouchable seeds, not flexible spending with a different label. Every time life hits you, your first task is to protect the system, if at all possible. Fourth, nudge contributions upward with income, not violently, not theatrically, quietly, repeatedly. Let the pipes widen as you widen. Fifth, expect disappointment in the beginning. If the numbers do not flatter you early, that does not mean compounding is broken. It means you are standing where compounding has to begin. Six, understand that the biggest threat in the first decade is not the market, it is cancellation. The person who stays in the game with a modest, boring, automated system usually beats the person who keeps restarting with grand intentions. That is not because modesty is magical. It is because continuity is. I want to leave you with one more hard truth. A lot of people want the later gifts of compounding without paying the early price of feeling foolish. They want the handoff without the boredom. They want the second worker without years of protecting the payroll. They want visible growth before invisible discipline. They want future power without present ordinariness. They want the last 10 years while disrespecting the first 10. That is not how the machine works. The machine makes you prove yourself at the beginning. It asks a very simple question. Can you keep feeding me when I still look weak? If the answer is yes, then one day the account may surprise you. One day you will wake up and realize that the worker you hired with tiny, forgettable contributions has become a serious force in your life. One day a good market stretch will do more than your monthly deposit. One day the gap between what you put in and what the account produces will feel morally shocking. One day your younger self will seem like a silent laborer who kept showing up in the dark, so your older self could finally stop carrying everything alone. That is the handoff. That is the night shift. And that is why your first small, boring, emotionally underwhelming years matter so much more than they feel like they do, because they are not the years where compounding proves itself. They are the years where you prove you are the kind of person who will still be there when it finally does.